Harlem has its own radio station.
For you and yours, WHCR 90.3 FM. The livest party in the whole universe.
The voice of Harlem.
The New York City Commission on Human Rights does not provide legal advice. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the views or position of the Commission. Enjoy the show. All right, we're live. Hello, New York. Welcome to Rights Here, Right Now, brought to you by the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I'm your host, Jose Rios, Chief of Staff at the Commission. And on the last Monday of every month, I'll be joined by guests here on WHCR 90.3 FM New York to bring you the info you'll need to live, work, and thrive, free from discrimination in the Big Apple. Before we dive into our discussion and introduce our guests, I want to share some background on our agency. The New York City Commission on Human Rights is the city agency that protects New Yorkers from discrimination in employment, housing, and public spaces. The Commission is charged with enforcing the city's human rights law, one of the broadest civil rights laws in the nation. The law prohibits discrimination in over 25 protected categories, such as race, age, gender identity, and sexuality. New Yorkers can report discrimination to our law enforcement bureau by calling 212-416-0197 or visiting our website, nyc.gov/humanrights. The Commission also seeks to root out discrimination where it grows by implementing policies that address sources of bias and by conducting outreach to educate New Yorkers on their rights and responsibilities under the law. The Commission's Community Relations Bureau provides training and workshops grounded in the idea that our rights are interconnected and that we all have a role to play to advance equity in New York City. I'm joined in the studio by our agency's Commissioner and Chair, Annabel Palma, and Deputy Commissioner of Policy and External Affairs, Joann Kamuf-Ward. In honor of Women's History Month, we will be discussing the vast protections afforded to New Yorkers as it relates to gender. As a content warning, today's episode will feature discussions about sexual harassment. To start off our first episode, our team wanted to share an audio recording about the rich history of our agency and the values it champions.
2024 marks 80 years since New York City recognized
that in order to address racial disparities, concrete action was needed.
Harlem had been the site of racial tension, police violence, and unrest
that flared in 1935 and again in 1943.
As in many cities across the country,
Mayor Fiorella LaGuardia took a step by creating the Mayor's Committee on Unity
to address citywide concerns about race relations and
make New York City a place where people of all races and religions
may work and live side by side in harmony
and have mutual respect for each other, and where democracy is a living reality.
The early days of the committee were met with challenges.
Members tried to effect change using persuasion,
but the committee lacked any teeth to bring about real change.
By the mid-1950s, it was clear that without legal enforcement powers,
the committee couldn't holistically address
the causes and manifestations of discrimination and bias in New York City.
As a result, the committee was reorganized and granted investigative authority.
The new permanent city agency was renamed the Commission on Intergroup Relations.
The Commission was given the power to
receive and investigate complaints,
initiate its own investigations,
hold hearings,
and make recommendations to the mayor.
And the Commission leveraged this mandate to study prejudice in New York City
and open channels of dialogue between racial, religious, and ethnic groups throughout the city.
This remains a core function of the Commission, which works daily to cultivate a culture of dignity and respect,
working with city agencies and communities.
The Commission made recommendations to the mayor and also worked with state and federal actors to develop
best practices in preventing and responding to acts of bias and discrimination.
The late 50s and 60s saw an increase in passage of city laws
to overtly tackle racial and ethnic discrimination and disparities, starting with housing.
As the Commission's authority expanded, its name was changed to better capture the wide breadth of its mandate.
In 1962, the agency became the Commission on Human Rights.
Complementing the change in name, in 1965,
the New York City Human Rights Law was passed
and extended the Commission's jurisdiction to prosecute discrimination based on race, color, national origin, and other protected categories
in employment, public spaces, and housing.
In the years since, the Commission's own focus on anti-Black racism
has been informed by conversations agency staff had with Black New Yorkers.
Those insights guided our anti-Black racism report and helped us identify steps for strengthening our work to combat anti-Black racism.
We continue to examine the role racism has played in the 5 boroughs,
aiding in the fight for civil rights for years to come.
So that New York is a place where people can live, work, and thrive.
Free from discrimination.
And now that you know a little bit of the Commission's history and our work, let's get into today's discussion. Commissioner, you are a lifelong New Yorker, a Bronxite, and you've dedicated your career to public service. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing in the Bronx and how that formed your path to get here today?
I cannot imagine living anywhere else but here in New York, and I have to tell you that growing up wasn't easy. I saw my mother struggle and deal with many of the issues that the Commission now has protections for, like housing and employment, and even trying to use our public parks. At the time where I was being raised, we had to deal with drug infestations and poor conditions in our parks as well as in our housing. I saw my mom having to move over and over again because the places that we would rent were not adequate for families to live in, or the landlord just suddenly disappeared and left the tenants to fend for themselves. Today, I get up every single day thinking about what we went through and wanting to fight for New Yorkers not to have to go through the same struggles that we went through.
Wow, that's really inspiring. You started your career working in the healthcare field, and now you're commissioner and chair of the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired that pivot in your career from working in healthcare into advocacy and organizing, and that leads you to be in this role now?
Sure. I had an opportunity to go work at a brand new nursing home in the Bronx called St. Vincent de Paul. And those opportunities were created through a partnership with the Archdiocese of New York and Borough President Fernando Ferrer at that time. And it was to give an opportunity for Latino families who were having to take care of their older parents but had to work, to have a place where their parents can go and still be within the reach of the community near their families. And so through that opportunity, there was a community benefits agreement created. We in the community had the opportunity to apply to this program that took us to a training in Bronx Community College and then allowed us to be hired by the nursing home. And that opportunity was the pivotal moment in my life. I had my son already. He was going to be 2 years old. I was really young. I was 18 years old and wondering how I was going to take care of him and not wanting to be in a position where I would have to be second guessing how I was going to feed my son. And so that opportunity changed my life. And walking into St. Vincent de Paul to be able to do nursing work to care for others helped me also be more mindful of the needs of my community. In St. Vincent de Paul, I quickly learned that we had to stand up and protect each other as workers, whether it was standing up and raising our voices against management telling us we couldn't speak Spanish to the residents who their primary language was Spanish, to making sure that we organized and were able to bring in a union to protect our rights as workers.
So organizing and going into the world of union eventually led you to serve in government, and you spent many years as a council member representing District 18. How did serving in that capacity help frame your understanding of how to support the community?
I think every experience, led me to the next. The experience in the nursing home led me to then become a full-time organizer for the greatest healthcare workers union, 1199. And through that organizing, again, fighting for worker protections, fighting for health and safety in the workplace on behalf of workers, allowed me to gain the understanding of what individuals needed to make their lives better. Through that work, I was recognized as a leader, and the opportunity to run for office presented itself. And while I was a little nervous and very scared, my community embraced the organizing efforts that we did when we launched our campaign. And it was one of the most successful campaigns that community has seen in a long time. And I was able to served District 18 for 14 years as their council member. When I got into that role, I thought things had changed tremendously. And while I lived in that community my whole life, what I quickly learned was that the issues that my mom struggled through, that the issues that we struggled through while I was growing up were still very prevalent. The issues in housing, the issues in irresponsible landlords, right? The issues of employment, especially for individuals who were dealing with immigration status, issues of not getting a sound education in certain areas of our city, and marginalized communities experienced that, the lack of resources that were coming to the community. So I was able to, with the support of the community and the support of my colleagues in the city council, change what my community looked like for the better.
As an unapologetic Latina, how does that experience inform your approach to leadership at the commission, but also just in life and in your career?
You know, you have to put yourself in people's shoes. You have to want to understand what they're going through and really listen to what the needs are. Coming to the commission has enabled me to be part of a team that shows up every single day, dedicated to ensuring that New Yorkers' rights are protected, right? And that's the mission, and that's our goal, and that's what we strive for every single day. And without having gone through some of the experiences that I went through, my understanding wouldn't be as deep. That's what I fight for every single day, for someone not to have to experience what I experienced.
We're also joined today by Deputy Commissioner of Policy and External Affairs, Joann Kamuf-Ward, and I want to bring her into this next conversation, which is a little more lighthearted. Part of the show is we want to give folks a view into our work and who we are and people, and so I like to ask folks, what's one of your favorite things to do in New York City? And Commissioner, I'll start with you.
There's lots of things I like to do in New York City. My favorite is summer nights in City Island. Any place in City Island you visit is amazing. I also enjoy our public spaces in the Bronx, whether it's the Bronx Zoo, the Botanical Garden. Like, there's so many things to do in the city. I'm a Bronx girl, born and raised, and so that's why I'm mentioning all my favorite places in the Bronx. But even taking the ferry from Soundview into the city, it's an amazing, amazing experience.
Deputy Commissioner, you're also a lifelong New Yorker.
I'm from Brooklyn, and one of my favorite activities is to walk over the Brooklyn Bridge, especially at sunset. The Brooklyn Bridge is lit up really beautifully now, but the commissioner mentioned the Botanic Gardens, and I'll give a shout out to the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens and the Bronx as well, especially now when trees are blooming and spring is on its way.
We have great outdoor spaces in the city, and I think people don't actually, who might not be New Yorkers or live in New York, might appreciate how much green spaces we have that are beautiful, and that's why I love spring and summer in New York. You can be outside as much as you can. Well, thank you both for sharing, and I'm going to apologize in advance because the three of us work together in the office, and I'm so used to calling you Annabel and Joann, and I'm going to try my best to say Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner, but I might slip up, so please forgive me in advance.
Annabel is fine with me.
I will think about it.
Commissioner, you spoke about how you've witnessed and experienced discrimination at a time where you were not aware of the protections against that kind of treatment. These experiences fueled your career and encouraged you to speak out and to seek opportunities that were centered in educating the public on their rights and responsibilities, which is part of the commission's mandate. And I think one of the things that I admire about your leadership at this commission is that from day one, you've said, we all have rights, we all have responsibilities. And so with that, let's jump into how the New York City Human Rights Law protects New Yorkers against gender discrimination and promotes gender equity. The Adams administration ushered in an all-time record high job total with 4.3 million jobs across the 5 boroughs. And the commission's work to make sure that everyone applying to those jobs is treated with dignity and respect. In New York City, no one can be treated less well because of their gender at work, while searching for housing or in public spaces. The law also protects New Yorkers from discrimination based on their reproductive and sexual health decisions, pregnancy, as well as from sexual harassment, areas that commonly intersect with gender. As we are painfully aware across the country, the freedom to make sexual and reproductive health decisions are under threat. Let's first talk a little bit about what sexual and reproductive health decisions are, and then explain how this intersects with the New York City Human Rights Law. And I'll start off with you, Deputy Commissioner Kamuf-Ward.
Thank you. And as we're sitting here in Harlem during Women's History Month, I feel really honored and privileged to be able to talk about the protections that exist in New York City, and which is one of the reasons that we feel so lucky to be here serving New Yorkers. So I'll start with sexual and reproductive health decisions and how those are protected by the City Human Rights Law. The City Human Rights Law, as we mentioned, is an anti-discrimination law, so it prohibits lots of employers and housing providers from treating people differently on the basis of protected categories in the law. So what does that mean for sexual and reproductive health decisions? It means that employers cannot discriminate against an employee or treat an employee less well based on a decision that they make to receive services related to their reproductive system and its functions. So I want to give some examples about what that looks like for you who might be listening today. Some examples of decisions that are protected in the workplace are those that are related to family planning services and counseling. That includes abortion, it includes birth control, emergency contraception, sterilization, and pregnancy testing. The law also covers fertility-related medical procedures and, importantly, the decision to receive hormone therapy or transition-related care for transgender New Yorkers. So it's all well and good to know what the protections are. I think it's also helpful to explain what violations might look like. An example of actions that would violate the human rights law could be an employer that criticizes employees for pursuing in vitro fertilization, also known as IVF. Could be an employer firing an employee after learning that the employee has had an abortion. It could also look like a supervisor avoiding meetings with an employee on their team after learning the employee has sought preventative treatment for HIV. So these are really all very important protections that reflect histories of bias and discrimination that we've seen in our city, and which the Commission and City Council and the administration are fighting actively to address.
Commissioner, how does it feel to be the head of an organization that has these types of protections built into their work?
It's humbling to be able to do this work day in and day out, especially knowing the many complaints that we get, knowing that so many individuals, so many employers, so many landlords and providers of public spaces that still don't know what their obligations are or their responsibilities. And I think while I was listening to Joann lay out some examples, I think about my own experience when I was 17 and I was pregnant with my son, and the school administration in my high school took me out of my honors classes and wanted to put me in special education classes because I was pregnant. That is wrong. My grades were good. There was no reason why they needed to hide me away. And so we need to ensure that people's reproductive rights are not violated in any way, shape, or form. And so to be able to head the agency that would ensure that those protections are intact is quite humbling.
So let's talk about pregnancy for a little bit and how the New York City Human Rights Law protects people from discrimination in work based on pregnancy.
Would love to, and I'm hearkening back to my own experience. I have 2 children, and it's challenging enough for anyone out there to get through 9 months of pregnancy just day to day, and then to face potential discrimination in employment or not to be able to pump breast milk or breastfeed can all be very, very challenging. But what is amazing about the New York City Human Rights Law is that it protects the decisions we've already talked about, but it also protects people while they are pregnant, and then it protects people who may be lactating as well. So what does that mean? In New York City, employers have been required to provide pregnant employees with something that is called a reasonable accommodation for over a decade. People may have been hearing a little bit more about pregnancy protections because federal law was just changed recently last year through the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act to extend this protection that New Yorkers have long had to others across the country. A reasonable accommodation is something that is meant in your workplace to help you be able to fulfill the essential functions of your job. That can include an altered schedule, the ability to go to doctor's appointments. It can mean breaks. It can mean modifications to the type of work you are doing, or something as simple as having a chair or a bench to rest if you're someone who works on your feet all day. So we have those protections for pregnant people, but New Yorkers are also very lucky because the human rights law also requires lactation accommodations. So someone who is pumping breast milk has to have A, time to do that, but B, space to do that, which is really important for people, especially that don't have their own offices, which is probably most New York City employees.
Dedicated space and a clean space, not just any space, but a space that's adequate for a mom who's lactating to be able to feel comfortable and to be able to continue to pump.
totally 100% right. So it's a space that has access to water where possible, has a refrigerator where possible. And besides the space itself, employers are required to have policies that set that out. So it's not up to a lactating employee to have to figure out, what am I going to do when this situation happens? It should be something the employer creates. Another piece I want to talk about related to the broader picture of gender protections that we're speaking about, but in particular related to pregnancy that is against the law, is harassment, jokes, or comments that are demeaning or humiliating. So if they are about someone who's pregnant or lactating, that's a violation of the law. But similar protections also relate more broadly to individuals' genders in the workplace.
Joann, you mentioned jokes and comments, and I want to reiterate a content warning that we will be discussing topics around sexual harassment. And so jokes and comments can create a hostile work environment and are never acceptable. And the Commission does a fair amount of education work to combat sexual harassment. Deputy Commissioner, can you speak on the Commission's work addressing and preventing sexual harassment?
Sure. And I think one of the things we'll be talking about today is some of the campaigns we've done. And I think the anti-sexual harassment campaign, It's Not a Joke, is one that is very easy to internalize. We have long understood that words can be quite painful to people. They can create a hostile work environment. And so part of the protections under the City Human Rights Law relate to ensuring that people feel safe in their workplace. That means that employers and colleagues should not engage in behavior that is demeaning or humiliating or offensive, and employers who become aware of such behavior need to take corrective action. And I think a myth about sexual harassment in particular is that it can happen only in the workplace. That's not true. I think that's also important as we have a remote work world now. Harassment can occur off-site at gatherings where you are together with colleagues that are work-style events at restaurants or bars and other places. And I think one thing that our commission has long been focused on is prevention, taking the onus off of individuals who may be more likely to experience discrimination by focusing on those who have responsibilities under the law. So if you go to our website, you will see we have available to everyone a free training on sexual harassment that really drills down into some of the scenarios that would violate the law, as well as what types of actions employers and supervisors and others should be taking.
You mentioned one of our campaigns, and I think sometimes we just hit the mark. You mentioned the jokes and comments, and we literally have a poster that says, "It's just a joke," and joke is scratched out and says, "It's sexual harassment." Anyone interested in taking our training should visit our website at nyc.gov/humanrights. And also just any of our trainings, you can get more information about that on our website.
And one piece that I'll just flag, the importance of doing trainings like the Human Rights Law training when employers don't own what's happening in the workplace and when colleagues don't stand up for each other, that's when violations of the law can occur. And another wonderful resource you'll find on the website is some of the final decisions and orders that the Commission has issued around employers who have failed to prevent their workplaces from being places where sexual harassment has been happening, either through their actions or failure to take action when they know something is amiss.
Let's switch gears a little bit to discuss about some of the amendments to the New York City Human Rights Law that occurred under your tenure, Commissioner. In March of 2022, City Council expanded the city's human rights law to protect domestic workers. Who are domestic workers, and how do they interact with our law?
Domestic workers include nannies, home care workers, house cleaners, or any other employee who is employed in a home providing childcare, elder care, companionship, housekeeping, gardening. These individuals tend to work in isolated places because they tend to be maybe the only person working in that particular space. They were in the shadows and were not able to go anywhere and share what was happening in their workplace. And so now the Commission does protect domestic workers. So we've done campaigns to do outreach to ensure that anyone who's a domestic worker know that they're covered under the Human Rights Law now. And so we encourage anyone who is in those spaces, if they experience any type of discrimination, to give us a call. But we were also intentional in doing outreach to the individuals who employ domestic workers to know what their responsibilities and obligations were under the New York City Human Rights Law.
Yeah, it's really helpful when the law matches the needs of the people, right?
Yes.
And so one of the things is like domestic workers was like a really confusing part for us because sometimes you were covered, but this more explicitly covered those workers.
One thing I'll say about the domestic workers provisions in particular that has been really amazing is that the amendment to the law was really carried forward by domestic workers and domestic worker organizations. They were there negotiating the bill with City Council. They were there at the signing of the bill, and they've remained really important partners for the commission as we do the education and outreach that the commissioner was mentioning. And I think if people take away one or two things from this show today, I think one is if you are a domestic worker, when you are in someone's home, that is a workplace.
Yep.
If you employ a domestic worker in your home, that is their workplace. And so what do you want your workplace to look like? And how do we make sure that that is the workplaces that are being cultivated to all New Yorkers, regardless of their chosen careers?
So Joann, your team did some research with worker-owned cooperatives, many of which are domestic worker services. Can you tell us a little bit about that work and what your team learned?
I mean, this work, and my colleagues have heard me say this before, is really personal to me. My mom was a home healthcare worker, and my grandmother was a cleaner and a domestic worker. So understanding what it means to be in workplaces where you're not treated with dignity and respect is something that my family has thought about a lot. It's not only a discrimination issue, it's also an economic justice issue, which is why it's so important to think about how these protections fit together to make, as we said at the start, a place where New Yorkers can thrive. And we've seen over time a trend in the employment space of workers moving towards building worker power. And one of the ways that people do that is by creating worker-owned cooperatives. That's been especially true in communities of color and immigrant communities in New York City. So recognizing the link between both economic justice and worker power and discrimination, one of the things that we did in 2023 was to partner with the Center for Family Life, which is a service-providing organization in Sunset Park in Brooklyn who has long been incubating and supporting worker-owned cooperatives, to hold listening sessions with the worker owners themselves to identify not only why were they going into worker-owned cooperatives, but how that was impacting their ability to enjoy the human rights that they are entitled to under city law. So we held over the year a number of sessions, largely in Spanish. A lot of the participants were women. A lot were from families that had recently or at some point in the last 30 to 40 years arrived in the United States. And one of the most common themes in those sessions was that people in their workplace prior to joining a worker-owned cooperative experienced sexual harassment. So this goes back to the importance of anti-discrimination protections and the link again to how do we make this a city for everybody.
I had the honor of helping facilitate some of these sessions in Spanish, and it was really interesting to see how that came up over and over again in people's experiences. And so even the divide in what folks experience based on their gender in the workplace was so apparent. A clarifying question on this one. So now that the law's been amended for almost 2 years now, is the status as a domestic worker a protected category under the Human Rights Law?
Okay, this one is for all the lawyers out there. Protected categories is a list of identity characteristics that are protected under the Human Rights Law, and you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of protected category. But to answer the actual question, domestic workers is not a protected category. What City Council did when they amended the law was to say that workplaces of domestic workers with one or more employees counted as an employment space where all the provisions of the Human Rights Law would apply.
So let's talk about another recent addition to our law, salary transparency. Something I always like to highlight is how the city's human rights law protects both employees and job seekers. In early 2023, we ran a campaign called Display the Pay to highlight salary transparency as a new protection. Can you talk a little bit about how salary transparency helps promote gender equity. I know people might not make that connection, right? But like, it's such a huge deal, right? To know like how much a job is going to pay before you apply for it.
What this aims to do is to level the playing field, right, for those who are seeking a job, and it aims to close the gender pay gap by allowing everybody, regardless of gender, to be paid in a way that reflects their skill set. For me, when this was passed, it was, again, one of those pivotal moments in my life where I did a lot of reflecting. My mom in the early 80s was a home care worker. I remember when she passed away, she had a lot of, I was looking through some of her things and I found her IDs and I found some old pay stubs and saw what she was getting paid at that time. And I was already working for $11.99, so I was able to do a little bit of research and background on some of the agencies that she had worked for and noticed that she was getting paid far less than some of her counterparts because her primary language was in English, right? She was Spanish-speaking, a Latina woman working as a home care worker. But at that time, the women were making less than the men, and if you spoke broken English, you got paid less. Not because she didn't know the job and she didn't have the skills to do the job, but because of her accent and maybe not dominating the English language. And this law aims for employers to really value the skill set that an individual brings to the table.
And I think, just hearing you say that and going back to the point we were making earlier about worker power and how the law can be a tool to attempt to even out some of the power imbalance in the workplace. I think display the pay and salary transparency is a huge piece of that. It doesn't leave it up to someone who's applying for a job to have to raise the awkward question of how much is this job going to pay? And then to bear the onus of saying, wait, that's actually not enough. I'm worth more than that, which has historically relegated certain populations to being paid less. It's also important to think about that in context with another protection in the law, which has been in place since 2017, which is a ban on employers asking, how much did you make at your prior job?
Let's talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about the other, because this is part of a larger suite of protections, right? And salary transparency is one. And so let's talk a little bit about those other job seeker protections.
The requirement that employers post a salary range in good faith, so that means a realistic range they're really going to pay, plus the ban on people asking you how much you made before are really meant to address what the commissioner was just talking about as an experience that her mother had, right? One experience where you get underpaid should not relegate you to a lifetime of being paid less than others. So here, even if you have one experience pre these laws, now you're in a position where things can change.
Another protection that we have in this law is credit history. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm going to borrow from us by saying the takeaway here, again, is you're more than your credit score, right? I think historically there have been lots of tools that employers and housing providers and businesses have used to weed out certain types of employees. That includes the things we were just talking about, wages. It also includes questions about people's credit score, which has zero relevance in most jobs to anything about the skills and qualifications that you hold as an individual. So the law limits employers' use of credit checks in the employment context. There's another one that I think we have to add as a gender issue, even though this might not be how people think about it. Criminal history protections in employment, which we call the Fair Chance Act. It's a gender issue because the fastest growing population of incarcerated persons are women and women of color. The Fair Chance Act says that employers cannot ask about arrest or conviction history until after you have gone through several steps of employment process and received a conditional offer. The idea of that timeline is that an employer has met you, they've assessed your skills and qualifications. It's a much different calculus to say we have a candidate who we like and they've had this thing in their past than it is to look at a piece of paper where someone has checked, I have a felony conviction. So the idea is that we're advancing equity in workplaces in New York City by having people's skills and qualifications come first. And hot off the presses, for everyone who's listening, we will have future episodes that talk about how this type of protection will be in place in the housing sphere. in New York starting in January 2025. So fair chance housing is coming to you.
These types of protections are crucial. The reason they exist is because this discrimination is out there, right, Commissioner? And
Correct.
so, like, what would these types of protections meant to you while you were working in any other type of job?
It would have meant one less thing to worry about, right? Wanting to be able to prove my skill set rather than having to worry about, was I going to get paid equivalent to someone that was not a woman?
Because I speak Spanish, because I'm a woman, because I'm brown. Those
Correct.
are all things that people think about, right? I think one of the things, and I'm going back to salary transparency specifically, one of the things that I think makes it a much more important protection than a lot of people think is that not everyone is prepared to go to the negotiation table. And this gives you a start, right? It opens the door to talk about salary in, like Joann was saying, a non-awkward way of asking,
Right.
how much are you going to pay me? So Commissioner Palma, Deputy Commissioner Kamuf-Ward, thank you so much for joining me today. Our very first episode of Rights Here, Right Now. This has been a great conversation about all the ways that the Commission shows up for women and continues to show up for women in New York City. And I'd like to close out today's discussion with the Commission's commitment to New Yorkers. As someone who helped draft this, Joann, would you care to do the honors?
Sure. This was a team effort, though. I feel like I'm an advertisement for our website. I guess I am. It's also on our website. This is something that really is a statement for us. We care about transparency and we care about New Yorkers. So here I go. For over 80 years, the Commission has fought for a city free from discrimination where all New Yorkers can live, work, and thrive with dignity. Our work was born out of the need to address racial tension and disparities, work which remains central today. Diversity is the source of our city's strength. Honoring our differences, the Commission uses law, education, and community engagement to unify our city, even at our most challenging moments. The Commission works to center equity in the day-to-day lives of all New Yorkers, informed by the varied histories and lived experience of the communities we serve. To advance fundamental rights for all New Yorkers, the Commission is committed to forging pathways to justice for individuals impacted by discrimination, resulting in individual remedies and systemic policy change through litigation. The Commission is also committed to cultivating respect, understanding, and inclusion to prevent discrimination via education, outreach, and community engagement. And finally, the Commission is committed to shaping laws and policies that eliminate root causes of discrimination and advance equality, working with government and community partners. So our work continues to grow and evolve to meet the needs of all New Yorkers. That's all of you listeners. And if you witness or experience discrimination, you should contact us at 212-416-0197 or visit our website, nyc.gov/human rights.
If you feel like you've been discriminated against but don't know, still call us, right?
Still call us. Let us handle it.
Any last thoughts, Commissioner?
We are living hard times. We are living in a place where we have people that want to divide us. And I would let New Yorkers know that we are one New York from all walks of life, but all here together in ensuring that we protect each other. And so I would always ask everyone to respect their fellow New Yorker and treat each other with respect and dignity.
Well, thank you both. And thank you for all those who joined us today. This has been Rights Here, Right Now, brought to you by the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Follow us on our social media at NYCCHR and NYC Human Rights on YouTube. Find more information about the Commission at nyc.gov/human rights. See you next time.